wonderful to see you again. Gee, you were just here a moment ago, it seems. Like last week. Do you find that the year was stuck in a glacier at the beginning, and now it's flying by with rockets attached to its back? I was trying to say jets and rockets, and I was coming up with they're just flying. There was a song that we were growing up. This Feast of Christ the King reminds me of something that goes way, way back. And it was part of our indoctrination in the Catholic school. And it was called An Army of Youth. Anybody remember that hymn? I say this because generally kings had armies. In fact, that's how you got to be a king, how you stayed being a king. You had an army. And so, Chris, I think you're way too young for this. Much. That's right. It says, but it was, an army of youth flying the standards of truth. We're fighting for Christ the Lord. Heads lifted high, Catholic action our cry, and the cross our only sword. On earth's battlefield, never a vantage will yield, as dauntlessly on we sing. Comrades true, dear and due, 'neath the Queen's white and blue, for our flag, for our faith, for Christ the King. And there's a wonderful refrain, which I won't go into. Today, Pontius Pilate knew what a king was. Pilate served the most powerful king in the world at the time, Caesar. And Pilate knew about the power a king has, the absolute authority that he wields, the unquestioning obedience that he demands, and the power that he has to compel obedience when it is not willingly given. I'm quoting from Pastor Mikey Anders, a Lutheran pastor, who just had some wonderful things to say about this, and I'm borrowing liberally from it, but to him is the credit. He says, this gospel presents the trial where Jesus stands before the man who represents all of the power and might of imperial Rome. And so when Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king? Jesus has been beaten and scourged and is brought before him with a crown of thorns and bleeding. And so surely Pilate's question is meant as a joke, because the Jewish people are a captive people. They have no army. Pilate stands there backed up by a huge Roman occupation force. He looks at this forlorn, whipped and bleeding rabbi and says, are you king? What a question. And Jesus calmly responds, do you say this by yourself, or did others tell you about me? And then, of course, Pilate says, I'm no Jew. But then there's this question, though. You are a king, followed by Jesus' assertion when he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He says, you are a king. And we're beginning to get the point of this courtroom drama. The kingdoms of this world depend upon armies and violence for their power. But Jesus says, my kingdom is not like any you have ever seen before. By the end of this scene, we know the answers. Jesus is king. He is truth. And anyone who listens to the truth hears his voice. The most interesting line in the gospel passage, which was cut out, but it's where Pilate, the consummate politician, when Jesus says, anyone who hears my voice hears the truth. And Pilate says, truth? What's that? Because truth can be molded to be anything you want it to be in the time of when people are in control of what to hear, what to say, what to think. In a book entitled Whispering the Lyrics, Tom Long tells of a scene similar to that of Jesus before Pilate. And so we have to remember that Jesus is truth. He is a king, but he is not from the kingdom of the world, but rather from God's kingdom, which is inbreaking into this world in his person. And it began with the word of God being preached in the prophets, with the word made flesh in the incarnation, which is what in Advent we're going to begin to start preparing for. And so this last Sunday of the liturgical year reminds us of the bookends of time. God will come, God will return. The Lord is king. So Tom Long tells of a scene similar to that of Jesus before Pilate. He says, during the prime days of the struggle for racial integration in the South. Black civil rights workers, freedom riders they were called, would travel on buses from city to city challenging segregationist laws. Sometimes they were greeted with violence, often they were arrested. The jailers did everything possible to make them miserable and to break their spirits. And he tells about this instance where they tried to deprive them of sleep. There was a bus that was heading to the city to stand up for civil rights. It was stopped. The whole bus was thrown into jail on the slimmest of charges. And as they were there, the jailers tried to deprive them of sleep and to break their spirits with noise and light during the nights, to make them miserable, to make them regret that they had come. They gradually took over their mattresses one by one, hoping to create conflict over the remaining ones. They were trying to help the people who came together to fight for the truth would then fight among themselves. It says, eventually the strategy seemed to be taking hold. This is Tom Long talking. He says, morale in the jail cells was beginning to sag. And then he said, one of the jailed leaders, looking around one day at his dispirited fellow prisoners, began softly to sing a spiritual. Slowly others joined in, until the whole group was singing at the top of their voices, and the puzzled jailers felt the entire cell block vibrating with the sounds of a joyful gospel song. When the jailers went to see what was happening, the prisoners triumphantly pushed the remaining mattresses through the cell bars, saying, "You can take our mattresses, but you can't take our souls." So Tom Long says it was the hymn singers who were in jail, but it was the jailers who were guilty. It was the prisoners who were suffering, but the jailers who were defeated. It was the prisoners who were in a position of weakness, but it was the broken and bigoted world of the jailers and of all the Pontius Pilates of history that was perishing. And this is quoted in a sermon by William Willimon on November 23rd, 1997. Now here's what Pastor Anders reminds us of. He says, King Jesus had a way of turning the world upside down. In the end, Pilate allowed Jesus to be crucified with the words, "King of the Jews," posted over his head in 3 different languages. Pilate was being sarcastic. But the irony was that Jesus was a king, just not a king like everybody expected. Now here's the point, the most important point on this Feast of Christ the King. Jesus wants to be the king of your life and of mine, not ruling with absolute power and compulsion, but in the absolute conviction that his way of life, modeled in his compassionate gift of self, is the example of what it means to be a disciple and is the purpose to which all of us from our birth are meant to be dedicated to, and especially in our baptism when we became children of God. St. Paul says, and this was in Latin, it was mihi vivere Christus. It is now not I that live, but Christ that lives in me. It is now not I that live, but Christ that lives in me. Listen, these are my thoughts here. To hold in the center of our hearts that his way of life is the only way of life truly worth living, since his kingdom is not formed by what the world values, by what the compassionate beating heart of God knows to be true. His kingdom is not formed by what the world values, but by what the compassionate beating heart knows to be true, where there will be a kingdom of peace and love, a kingdom of justice, and a kingdom where the poor are lifted up, they have the good news preached to them, the blind see, the lame walk, the last are made first. So the question is, will we let this kind of king be Lord in our lives? Will you and I let this kind of king be Lord in our lives? What is it that really governs what you and I set as our goals in life? And we should take a moment to really think about what is it that guides us. Because if you think about what it is that is the definitive formative principle that guides your life, that really is where your religion is. And that's what religion is meant to be. You know, it motivates us. It sets us on a path. And Jesus says that we have to be committed to the truth. This is a quote, but this is offered to us by God, and it may seem impossible, but nothing is impossible in God's grace. Nothing is impossible for God, and nothing is impossible but in God's grace. Now, here's a quote from a poem for Christ the King Sunday. It's from a Welsh poet, R.S. Thomas. He died in the year 2000. He was a Welsh poet and an Anglican priest who was fairly obscure, although he published 3 volumes of poetry. But until his Song at the Year's Turning collection of poems, which was a collection of poems from 1942 to 1954, he was relatively obscure, but he became quite famous after that. And this is a little poem for Christ the King Sunday called The Kingdom. R.S. Thomas is noted for the spareness of his language. He says it's a long way off, but inside it there are quite different things going on, the kingdom. Festivals at which the poor man is king and the consumptive is healed. Mirrors in which the blind look at themselves and love looks back. An industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. An industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life, rather than an industry that just pumps out more and more goods for us to buy and accumulate until we have so much in our house we have to put it somewhere else. You ever drive by the roads, by the way? This is not part of his poem. You ever drive down the road and you see so many of the extra sheds like smart cubes and storage areas and things? That's because we have so much stuff. And rather than give it to somebody else, we buy a shed and store it in that, just so we have it, so that when we die, someone has to go out there and sort through it. Industry is for mending the bent bones and the minds fractured by life. It's a long way off, but to get there takes no time, and admission is free. If you will purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only, and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. If you will purge yourself of desire and present yourself with your need only, and the simple offering of your faith, green as a leaf. St. Ignatius said, "Give me only your love and your grace. That's enough for me."